As Dean has pointed out, when MnDOT first posted the standard specs or the change standard specs on its website, its stated intent was to put an emphasis on the active voice. And needless to say, then when Dean and I went through the initial draft of those changes, we thought, well, okay, there might be a little more active voice here, but these are far more sweeping changes than simple grammar. And so we're going to talk today about a lot of the change in. Now, MnDOT's always been a little bit greedy in trying to put more risk on the contractor and less on itself, but I think it's even tipped that burden a little bit further in MnDOT's favor on these. And in addition to the risk allocation, it's added some additional procedural hurdles along the lines of claims and scheduling that MnDOT is basically going to say that if you don't follow these, you waive your right to have these claims. And in some cases, there's language stating that 100% of the payment can be withheld until you comply. I'm going to be talking about some of the sections that have some dramatic changes, claims and schedules, or claims. Jean will be talking more about the schedules and additional compensation in sections 1800 and 1900. MnDOT has stated that it's intending for these standard specs to start to apply starting on projects led after December 2nd, 2013. But when I talked to Joel Williams at MnDOT, he said that that is the intended rollout date, but even at that point, MnDOT doesn't necessarily expect that all projects led after that date will be using the revised specifications. However, he didn't know which projects would be using whether the old specs versus the new specs. But he did make an interesting comment to say that due to the progress of the plans and provisions was one of the reasons why some projects may still use the old specs. So I was hoping that that might mean that MnDOT might be willing still to discuss, as Dean mentioned with the sharing session, perhaps there's still a chance to work with MnDOT on some of the more troublesome sections. Section 1100, one wouldn't think that this would have a lot of pratfalls or pitfalls. Maybe that was a Freudian mistake there. That's obviously the section that contains acronyms and definitions. MnDOT did not provide this to us for our initial review, so we only ourselves got a chance to take a look at it within the last couple of months, and we noted that there are more than 70 new definitions, about a third of which pertain to scheduling. And so I think about 40% of the definitions that are now in the standard specs are brand new definitions. Now, one wouldn't think a definition would create potential risk, but the problem is that they've got some definitions that kind of fly in the face of what one is typically used to meaning, the meaning of that particular phrase. And some of the definitions themselves lack clarity. For example, and we're only providing a couple examples because to go through the problems with each and every definition would probably itself take 3 hours. But the errors and omissions, one thing's errors and omissions, I tend to think that means that there is some design defect or having related to do probably with a professional. But MnDOT has taken this term by saying multiple interpretations, meaning essentially errors and omissions according to MnDOT means you've got an ambiguity, not necessarily a particular mistake in the documents. Now they do say it's a deficiency, but apparently if you don't have an ambiguity, it's not an error and omission, and I think that creates confusion in the use of the definitions. Notice to proceed is another example of something that's a little bit confusing, or at least not well written, which is somewhat ironic given that they were trying to improve the style to make them more easy to read. But it talks about written notice to the contractor, and that makes sense. A notice to proceed would be a written notice, but then the second sentence states that it occurs upon the department's acceptance of the contractor's first preliminary schedule, implying that a notice to proceed is deemed upon a certain event. Is it an order, or is it simply if the department or if MnDOT accepts the schedule, is that in itself a notice to proceed? Some of the definitions are just inaccurate or basically overstate what's required in the law. A payment bond talks about the payment of all legal obligations, but the payment bond statute only requires it be for all just claims for the labor and materials. Now, to some of these, there might be a question of, well, so what? We rarely ever have a lawsuit about what this definition means. But I think to the extent that these new standard specs are adding confusion where none was needed, it basically makes it more hurdles for every contractor to have to jump through. And it also begs the question, then, are payment bonds now going to all be a problem because they're not going to necessarily state that it's for all legal obligations? They always specify the payment bond that it's going to be for suppliers and subcontractors. And so it begs the question then, would this provision be satisfied simply by MnDOT's acceptance of the bond that you submit? As I mentioned, about a third of the new definitions pertain to the significant changes in the scheduling requirements set forth in sections 1803 and 1806. And Dean will discuss those sections a little bit later. And I won't go through the meaning of each of these, but we wanted to point out that MnDOT is really kind of working to a bit of micromanaging of the schedule.